So we're still in Chapter 7, Discourse and Ideology of Terry Eagleton's book on ideology. All right. We ended the last video on Eagleton saying that seeing ideology solely in terms of its self-naturalization can be problematic. So we should beware of that, right? Beware of seeing ideology that way, and beware of those who stress it, right? Namely that they could be doing a type of ideology, right? Sort of the people that say, oh, there's a deep connection between language and the world, that somehow going through language you actually get to the world. But we should be aware of that sort of natural link view of ideology, but we should also have a look at the other side of things where people want to say, well, no, ideology isn't really looking at a natural link, but no link. And language then is entirely rhetorical, right? So that we've got to come up with something that we sort of say, well, whatever the world is, who knows? You don't get it through language. Language is something that's kind of disconnected, right? And we're not going to try and connect it up through some natural links or whatever. No, language is just disconnected from the world, and it's really an entirely a rhetorical type system. Eagleton thinks that's problematic too, and he wants to take a particular look at a particular spin on this no-link view of language, and the world, which he calls post-Marxism. And this is sort of think of it as kind of a little tradition, right? And what do we mean by post-Marxism? Well, that hopefully will come out as I go and follow Eagleton's discussion. But in this post-Marxism, he's talking right now first with Paul Hirst and Barry Hindness. And they kind of have this anti-epistemological strand in them, which is kind of a funny way to put it. I'm not comfortable with that way of putting it. But think of it as this post-Marxism wants to say, look, in the end, there's really no deep correspondence between thought language and reality. So we shouldn't be talking about, and we've seen this, right, that you shouldn't be talking about whether or not language fits or corresponds to a certain degree or not, or whatever, or maybe fails to correspond. So even if you say it fails to correspond, you're still within the way of speaking of a correspondence theory of truth, right? That when language corresponds, it gets it right, that's truth. When language doesn't correspond, gets it wrong, that's falsity. But the notion of falsity only, again, makes sense within this overall paradigm of speaking about whether or not that language can conform. And so when it doesn't, you have falsity. So the whole notion of truth and falsity is kind of bound up with this notion of a possible correspondence or not. But when we have this no correspondence kind of with these guys, we stop talking about that, and we are talking about, we just carve the world up, and reality is some unknown X, and we carve it up according to interest. Well, that should ring a few bells. That's our old buddy Nietzsche, who talked about that. Yeah, it's all about power, and power has interests and whatever, and that's how the world gets carved to service power. So language, again, with these guys, kind of in their sort of Nietzschean type framework, language is not reflecting, corresponding or not. Nah, get rid of that. Language is just something that signifies it. It gives a conceptual shape to reality. And you hear lots of people talk like this, that, yeah, who knows what reality is? We only know it through our concepts. That's what gives shape to it all. And Eagleton says, oh, once again, this is over the top. Like scientific discourse gives shape to reality by saying, well, okay, certain sections of reality we're going to call water, and some sections we're going to call like an acid, or like hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid, I think is the example he uses. Now, you might have other societies that don't have this scientific discourse or whatnot, but they're going to recognize these distinctions that maybe science uses. They might have different ways of describing them. It might not line up perfectly, but any society that doesn't at all make this distinction is going to run in, as he kind of makes a joke of it, they're going to run into some problems. They're not going to be around for very long. Maybe not every society has notions of gravity in the same sense that Newton bequeathed as part of the scientific tradition or whatnot. But Eagleton in this would say, I challenge you to go out and act like gravity doesn't exist. You won't be around for too long if you do that. You may not call it gravity. You might have different words. You might have different kind of ways of shaping what you think. But reality is going to be there no matter what. And there's going to be certain general, as Plato might say, there's going to be a certain kind of joints in the system, and you ignore them at your peril. And again, we might have different ways of slightly phrasing these things, of ways of conceptualizing it, but to say that the conceptualization gives the complete shape to reality, that is over the top to talk like that. And, you know, just plain old experience would tend to refute that hardcore kind of Nietzschean sort of just carving up the world according to interest, and that's the entire story. So yeah, language and conceptualization, sure, that plays a role in the carving of the world. There's some arbitrariness to it. How much? Kind of difficult to say, he says, but certainly not completely. And in that sense, we have to put the brakes on what could be just said is just kind of a straightforward Nietzschean kind of relativism or perspectivism, as he likes to say. Eagleton thinks that's a little over the top. Now, he thinks that this, Eagleton that is, thinks that this kind of post-Marxism also undermines a lot of other things. It undermines Marxism itself because Marxism, you know, bases a lot of what it's talking about on certain kinds of desires and the shaping of consciousness that we have. Where does that come from? How does post-Marxism deal with that? Well, Marxism thinks that, you know, this is sort of the orthodox view, that there really are distinctions in society. Like there really are, again, as Plato would say, there really are joints, right? Reality, you know, is the social reality is something that is cut at the joints, and the theory tries to handle that and see what desires are connected to what parts of the social reality. So there is a kind of realism to it. But in this framework, you don't have that realism anymore, right? There's no correspondence thought. Language is cut off from reality, whether it's the scientific reality or the social reality. And so Marxism reflects pre-existing interests, tries to capture those. Post-Marxism is going to say, well, that's not really there. So what happens with that? Well, it's going to run into some problems as well, similar to this, but I'll take that up in the next video. See you there.